The day my mother told 16 relatives that I was the reason she'd stopped telling people she had 2 daughters, she used her best dinner voice to do it. Thanksgiving at my aunt's house in Hamilton. The good china was out, the set she only brought down from the top shelf twice a year. 14 adults, 2 teenagers, my cousin's newborn, asleep in a carrier by the back door. A full house. The kind of gathering my mother loved precisely because it gave her an audience. My sister had been talking about a deal she'd just closed, a property in Oakville, something about a bidding war, $400,000 over asking, buyers from Toronto who hadn't even seen it in person. My mother's face had that particular brightness she saved for occasions involving my sister, lit from somewhere behind the eyes, the way a room looks when someone finally finds the light switch. She reached across the table and squeezed my sister's hand. Celeste has always known how to make the most of herself, she said, not to my sister, to the table, to the 16 people with turkey and butter tarts in front of them. Some people are just built for success. Then she turned and looked at me, not a glance, a verdict. And then there's our other daughter. She smiled, the patient smile of someone explaining something unfortunate. Still at the hospital, still in scrubs. A small laugh moved through the room, the kind that doesn't start with anyone in particular and ends with everyone. I keep telling her, you can care for people without spending your 40s emptying bedpans for $40 an hour. 16 people laughed, not nervously, fully, because my mother had gone first, and it is always safer to laugh with the person holding the room than to be the one who doesn't. I didn't move, kept my hands flat on the table on either side of my plate. My uncle was already reaching for more stuffing. My cousin was looking at his phone because that was easier than choosing a side. My sister cut her turkey with the small, settled smile she wore when she'd already won something. At the far end of the table, near the window, a man in his late 60s put down his fork. Warren Adler had been my aunt's neighbor for 11 years. Retired paramedic captain, 32 years with Hamilton EMS, hands that looked like they'd been used for actual work most of his adult life. He was the kind of man who filled a room without trying to, laughed loud, ate second helpings, always offered to carry things. He had not laughed with the rest of the table. He was staring at me. Not the way you stare at someone who's just been embarrassed, the way you stare at someone you've suddenly recognized from somewhere else entirely. I looked back at him, 2 seconds, 3. Anchor, I said, quietly. Not to him, not to anyone, just the word that, in certain moments, is the only thing that keeps you level, the one that reminds you of who you actually are when everyone around you is busy deciding who you aren't. Warren Adler stood up. His chair scraped back on the hardwood. A glass tipped, my cousin grabbed it before it fell. The room went quiet in the sudden, confused way rooms go quiet when nobody knows what's happening yet. Warren's face had gone the color of a January sky before snow. He was looking at me the way men who have seen actual disasters look at things they weren't expecting to find standing in a dining room in Hamilton, Ontario. My God, he said. His voice was low and rough and not entirely steady. You're the one they called Anchor. But before I tell you what Warren knew, and what he said next, and why the rest of that Thanksgiving dinner looked nothing like anything any of us expected, take a second and hit subscribe if you haven't already. Because what happened before anyone at that table understood who I actually was, that's the part nobody saw coming. Warren didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for my mother to redirect the conversation or for my sister to change the subject. He walked around the table to where I was sitting, pulled out the empty chair beside me, and sat down. The whole table had gone still. 16 people watching a retired paramedic captain pull up a chair next to the daughter nobody could brag about. I've been trying to figure out where I knew your face from, he said, voice dropped low. I thought it was from St. Joe's. I volunteer there on Thursdays. A pause. But it wasn't St. Joe's. He reached into the inside pocket of his fleece vest. The kind of vest that says you've spent 30 years layering against Ontario winters, and set a folded piece of newsprint on the table beside my plate. Then another. Then a third. 3 articles from the Hamilton Spectator and the Toronto Star, the kind with grainy photographs and headlines that tell you something large happened without telling you what it cost. All from different Novembers, 3 years apart. My mother's voice came from the far end of the table, smooth and patient, the way it gets when she's managing a situation she didn't plan for. Warren, I'm not sure what this. Excuse me, he said, but absolute. The room let him finish. November 14th comes back to me the way it always does when someone calls it forward. Not in sequence, not in complete sentences, in images, smells. The particular cold that comes off the 401 at 3 in the morning when the wind is moving east, and there is nothing between you and the highway but 40 meters of dark, and the sound of sirens stacking up behind each other like someone pressing the same note over and over. 17 vehicles, A tractor-trailer had jackknifed across all 3 lanes near the Ancaster interchange. Ice on the road that the sensors hadn't caught because the temperature had dropped 6 degrees in 40 minutes. By the time the first units arrived, 11 people were on the highway. The nearest Level 1 trauma center had already radioed. They were at capacity from a separate incident near Mississauga. We were it. I was charge nurse that shift. 8 years in the ER, 4 as charge. The kind of role that's difficult to explain at Thanksgiving because describing what a charge nurse actually does takes longer than anyone wants to sit still for. The first ambulance arrived at 3:17 a.m. with 3 patients. The second came 11 minutes later with 2 more and a radio call that 4 additional units were en route. Our ER had 8 functional bays and 2 nurses per shift already stretched from a Friday night that had started with 2 overdoses and a kitchen fire on the mountain. There is a specific moment in a mass casualty event when the numbers stop adding up. When the math of bodies against resources produces a number that isn't possible, and you have to decide, not the attending, not the administrator, not the medical director in his house in Dundas. You, the charge nurse standing in the middle of the triage bay with a radio in one hand and a blood pressure cuff in the other, have to decide what order the impossible happens in. I made 14 decisions in 40 minutes that the protocol manual does not have pages for. I converted the staff lounge into a secondary stabilization area. I pulled a respiratory therapist from the 4th floor. I authorized 2 nursing students mid-placement to perform interventions that technically required supervision I didn't have time to provide. I called the OR and told them to hold their recovery bays for overflow, and I told them it wasn't a request. By 6 in the morning, 11 of the 17 patients from the 401 were stable. 2 had not made it. One of them, the incident report called him Patient 7, had a ruptured aorta that no intervention on Earth was going to fix in the time available. The paramedics who brought him in knew it. The attending knew it. I knew it before the gurney cleared the ambulance bay doors. Gordon Ferris did not know it. Gordon Ferris was the hospital's chief operating officer. He arrived at 7 in the morning in pressed slacks and a lanyard that said Germanistrasane, and he walked through the ER the way administrators walk through ERs after something large has happened. Quickly, with the expression of a man already calculating what this is going to cost and who is going to be responsible for it. By noon, a memo had been drafted. By the following Monday, an internal incident review had been opened. By the end of that week, a narrative had appeared in the preliminary report suggesting that decisions made during the mass casualty event by nursing staff had contributed to suboptimal outcomes for patient 7. Suboptimal outcomes, that was the phrase they used for a man dying of a condition that was unsurvivable. My name appeared in that report 6 times. Gordon Ferris's name did not appear at all. The union filed a grievance. The grievance took 14 months. In those 14 months, the Hamilton Spectator ran a piece about the mass casualty response quoting hospital administration, praising the coordinated team effort that saved 11 lives. Ferris gave a quote for that article. I was described as part of the nursing team. I called home the night the incident review findings came back, not as a professional. As a daughter who had spent 14 months watching her name appear in documents that told the wrong story, who needed someone to say 3 words, I believe you. My mother listened the way she always listened, waiting to see where the story was going. I told her about the 401, the 17 patients, the 14 decisions, the 14 months, the report, the way my name sat in it, the way Gordon Ferris had given a quote to a newspaper from behind a desk. She was quiet until the last of it settled, and then, this is exactly why I thought teaching would have been better. More stability. Nobody writes incident reports about teachers. She didn't hang up. She kept talking, but I had already heard what I needed to hear. Chief Marsden, Chief of Emergency Medicine at St. Joe's, 27 years at the hospital, whose opinion of Gordon Ferris I had never once heard her express out loud, requested a meeting with me 3 days after the review closed. She did not express an opinion of Ferris at that meeting either. What she did was place a document on her desk and tap the top corner of it with one finger. I've had your file moved to the Provincial Nursing Review Board, she said. Outside Ferris's jurisdiction, she looked at me steadily. The review board will take 8 months. During that time, you're on administrative reassignment to our community outreach program. A pause. Nobody looks at community outreach. I looked at the document. The board will clear you, she said, because I've already submitted my own statement and the statements of every paramedic who was on that shift. The question is whether you survive this quietly or loudly. She folded her hands on the desk. Quietly means you're back in the ER in 12 months with your record clean. Loudly means Ferris has 18 months to damage you through channels I can't block. The report, I said, with my name in it, will remain in the system, she said. For now. Her eyes held mine. Some corrections take place on a longer timeline. How long? Long enough that you need to stay excellent in the meantime. I said I understood. She said good. I went to community outreach and I stayed excellent and I waited. That was 3 years ago. The articles Warren had laid on my aunt's Thanksgiving table were not about the 401. They were about the 2 incidents that came after. A high-rise fire in Stony Creek, where I spent a weekend coordinating triage with Hamilton Fire, a flooding response in Cambridge, where the Regional Health Authority called our unit in to manage field medical support. Neither article used my name. The first said charge nursing staff from Hamilton area hospitals. The second said regional healthcare team. But Warren had been at both. As a volunteer liaison through the Hamilton EMS Retiree Network, he had a habit of cutting out articles about events he'd been part of and underlining the details that told him more than the article said directly. Unit designations, response times, coordination decisions that don't happen by accident. He had recognized my face from across a staging area in Cambridge 14 months ago and not been able to place it until my mother said the words "just a nurse," and I said, "Anchor," and something clicked behind his eyes. I watched her make a field triage call in Cambridge that kept 4 people alive who wouldn't have reached the ambulance otherwise, he said. To my mother, to my sister, to the 16 people eating Thanksgiving dinner at my aunt's table in Hamilton. 32 years in this work. I know the difference between someone following a protocol and someone who's the reason everyone else can follow one. He picked up the 3 clippings from the table and set them in front of me. These belong to you, he said. Someone should have given them to you a long time ago. The Ontario Healthcare Leadership Gala was held at the Westin in Ottawa on the last Friday of November. Black tie. The kind of event where the price of a single table would cover 3 months of a junior nurse's salary. Gordon Ferris was listed in the program as that evening's recipient of the Award for Operational Excellence in Emergency Response. The award was sponsored by the Healthcare Innovation Foundation of Ontario. The foundation received a significant portion of its annual funding from the hospital Ferris ran. Chief Marsden had texted me the day the program posted online. 4 words, he actually accepted it. I drove to Ottawa, not because anyone asked me to, because I had stayed quiet for 3 years, and because some silences, if you let them go long enough, start to calcify into permanence. I wore my Nursing Association formal dress, dark navy, charge nurse pin on the left lapel, the Provincial Emergency Response Service medal beside it, awarded quietly through a process nobody had advertised. Warren met me at the hotel entrance. I hadn't asked him to come. After Thanksgiving, he'd called and said, "I'm going to Ottawa in November if you need someone to drive." I'd said I had my own car. He'd said, "Then I'll meet you there." That was the whole conversation. The program director found me at registration and said politely that my name wasn't on the guest list. "I'm not here as a guest," I said. "I'm here as a witness." He didn't know what to do with that. I walked past him into the ballroom. Ferris saw me from across the room before I found a table. I watched his face do the calculation, the navy dress, the pin, the medal, the face he had spent 3 years trying to make administratively invisible. Recognition arrived about 2 seconds after I sat down, and it did not improve him. He came to my table before the program started, because people like Gordon Ferris cannot tolerate variables they haven't accounted for. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said. The professional warmth was already deployed, the smile of a man who had spent a career performing reasonableness under pressure. "I imagine not," I said. He glanced at Warren. Warren looked back at him the way retired paramedics look at administrators, the steady, measuring look of someone who has spent 30 years watching how the decisions made in offices play out in the field. Ferris's smile held for another 3 seconds. Then he walked back toward the front of the room, and I watched his shoulders tighten with every step. The MC introduced him with a list of achievements that included courageous leadership during the mass casualty event of November 14th and decisive administrative action that protected patient outcomes during a crisis period. 200 people applauded. I kept both hands flat on the table. He opened with gratitude, moved to legacy, pivoted to a story about the importance of strong administrative leadership during mass casualty events, the kind of leadership that made the difficult calls so that frontline staff could focus on care. Then his gaze settled on my table. "I've worked alongside many nurses over the years," he said, and there was something in his voice aimed like a rifle across the room, who struggle with the boundaries of their role during high-stress situations. Overreach is common. It's human. But strong operational leadership means correcting course when individuals prioritize personal judgment over coordinated protocol. He was looking directly at me when he said it. Warren Adler stood up. Not quickly. The way a man in his late 60s stands when he has decided something, carefully, completely, with no interest in being stopped. I was there. His voice carried the way paramedic voices carry, trained for noise and designed to cut through it. On November 14th, I was in that ER until 6 in the morning. The room recalibrated. Ferris's expression didn't change. His knuckles went white on the podium. This woman, Warren pointed at me, steady, no performance, ran that ER while you were asleep in your house. I watched her make 14 decisions in 40 minutes that your protocols don't have language for. I watched her save 11 people. I watched the 2 who didn't make it. And I can tell you with 32 years in this work, there was nothing on this earth that was going to change those outcomes. A retired ER physician at the table 3 over pushed back her chair. She was in her 70s, posture straight from decades of standing over patients. Her voice was measured and clear. I treated 3 of the November 14th patients that morning. No operational direction came from this office that night. No extraction order from administration. She paused. Only one charge nurse made the calls. A man near the back rose. He was holding his teenage son's hand, the boy with the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd spent recent time in a hospital. My son was patient 11, he said. His voice broke in the middle and didn't fully recover. The nurse who held his airway open for 20 minutes while they waited for the OR. That's not protocol. That's a person deciding your child's life matters. From the second row, a young woman in scrubs stood up, still wearing her hospital ID badge, straight from a shift. Her hands were shaking. I was a nursing student on placement that night. She supervised me through 2 procedures I wasn't cleared to do alone. She didn't leave my side. A breath. I've been a nurse for 2 years. She's the reason I stayed. Ferris stepped back from the podium. The applause that had filled the room 20 minutes ago was completely absent. 200 people sat in silence that had the weight of a verdict. Chief Marsden rose from the front row. She didn't need a microphone. The Provincial Incident Review found no grounds for disciplinary action, she said, voice reaching every wall without effort. That finding was issued 8 months after November 14th. It was never publicized because the individual involved requested privacy. She looked across the room. The internal report that characterized nursing decisions as overreach was not supported by the review board's findings. That report was not the story. It was allowed to become one. She reached into her jacket and placed a single document on the table in front of her, the corrected record. She sat back down. The room did not applaud. It did something quieter and heavier. One by one, people rose, the ER physician first, then Warren, then the father with his son, then the nursing student. Row by row, the way things rise when the weight of them becomes too much to carry sitting down. I stood, kept my hands at my sides. From somewhere in the back, someone began to clap. Then another person, then the room. Gordon Ferris was still standing at the podium. 3 days after Ottawa, someone knocked on my apartment door. Soft, uncertain, the knock of someone who wasn't sure they had the right to be there. I checked the peephole. My mother stood on the step. No earrings, no lipstick, none of the things she wore like armor. Plain clothes, hair pulled back simply. In her hands, a tin of butter tarts. The same recipe she made for my sister's birthday every October. The exact same tin. It was the first time in my entire life she had brought those to my door. I stood on the inside for a long moment. Then I opened it. Didn't step back, didn't invite her in, just stood in the frame. Ivy. Her voice broke on the first syllable. I'm sorry, I didn't know. I looked at her. No anger in it, just clarity, the kind that takes a long time to arrive and once it does, doesn't make much noise. You didn't know, I said, or you chose not to ask. She started to speak. I've had the same phone number for 9 years, I said, voice level. Every transfer, every shift change, every time something large happened at that hospital, you had my number. You chose not to dial it. I looked at the tin. You chose to believe the story about me that was easier to believe. You performed it in front of 16 people at Thanksgiving dinner. You let a retired paramedic captain be the one to tell you what your own daughter had been doing. She was crying, not the calculating kind, the kind that comes from genuine shame, the kind too large to hold standing upright. Give me a chance, she said. She reached for my arm. I stepped back 1 pace, nothing dramatic, practical. You don't need a chance to understand me, I said. You need a chance to feel better about what you did. Those are 2 different things. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't check it until later, after the door was closed. It was a text from my sister. Can you call Mom? She's really upset. I think you were maybe a little harsh. Not 1 word about Ottawa. Not 1 word about November 14th, or the 401, or 3 years of administrative invisibility because a man with political connections had better access to the narrative than a charge nurse. Just a little harsh. That was the last answer I needed. No contact was no longer a question I was wrestling with. It was the verdict. Please go home, I said. Don't come back. I closed the door, the deadbolt turned. Dry, sharp, final, the shortest, most complete sound in this entire story. Warren runs a Thursday group out of the community center on Barton Street. Retired paramedics, nurses between shifts, social workers who need somewhere to set down what that they carry for everyone else. Plastic chairs. A coffee urn that's been there since the 80s. Grocery store muffins on a folding table, the kind nobody bakes from scratch and everybody eats. He asked me to come the week after Ottawa. I went in regular clothes, sat in the corner chair, back against the wall, sightline to both doors. Habit. No plan to speak. Mid-conversation, a young paramedic, mid-20s, the particular stillness of someone carrying something heavy, glanced over at me and stopped. "Your anchor," he said quietly, like he wasn't sure he was right. "Sometimes," I said. He looked at his hands for a moment. "I was on shift during the Cambridge flooding, student placement. I watched you call the field triages from the staging area." He swallowed. "I went home and told my partner I wasn't sure I was built for this, that it was too much." A pause. She said, "Give it another year." I gave it another year. I'm still here. He looked up. "But I always wanted to know, how do you not let it break you?" I looked around the circle. The paramedic in his 20s. The nurse who'd been doing this for 30 years. Warren, who'd done it for 32 and still showed up on Thursdays. The social worker with her hands wrapped around a paper cup like it was the warmest thing she'd touched all week. "It does break you," I said. "No script, just the truth. I'm not going to tell you it doesn't. It breaks you in small ways over and over, and you put yourself back together in between, and sometimes the shape isn't quite the same as before." I looked at him. "But the breaking isn't the end of the story. It's just the part that doesn't fit on an incident report." He nodded. Something in his face loosened. Outside, the November sky was already dark at 5 o'clock, the way Ontario goes dark in winter, like someone drawing a curtain without warning. I sat in my car for a few minutes before starting it, let the quiet settle around me. I thought about my mother sitting somewhere, with the butter tarts she'd taken back home untouched. I thought about Gordon Ferris waking up every morning from now on, knowing that 200 people in an Ottawa ballroom had watched 3 years of his carefully maintained version of November 14th dissolve in real time. I thought about Chief Marsden, who had told me once that some corrections take place on a longer timeline, and had been right, and had been in the front row to see it. I thought about Patient 7, whose name was not in any of the articles Warren had kept in his vest pocket for 3 years. A man whose aorta had given out on the 401 at 3 in the morning at a temperature that sensors hadn't caught, who had arrived already beyond what medicine can do, and whose death had been turned into a document with my name in it 6 times by a man who had never once set foot in an ambulance bay. I thought about anchor. It doesn't mean you don't move. It means you hold the line so everyone else can. I started the car, pulled out onto Barton Street into the orange and white lights of a city I'd spent my adult life working in. The same highways, the same exits, the same sounds. The radio stayed off. Just the road and the engine and the kind of quiet that doesn't ask to be filled. My mother would decide, in the weeks ahead, whether she had the capacity to do what she had never done before. I had no way of knowing which way that would go. I had arrived finally at the place where the answer either way was something I could carry. My sister would keep texting. That was fine. I had learned over the years how to read a text and know whether it was reaching toward me or reaching around me. Hers reached around. But Warren had asked me to come back next Thursday, and I had said yes. That was enough. The work was enough. The people who showed up on Thursday nights with paper cups and things they couldn't put down anywhere else, they were enough. I had spent years standing at the edge of every family photograph, years being the name that didn't get mentioned in the room, years being the daughter nobody led with. But I had also been the charge nurse on the 401 on November 14th at 3 in the morning, when 17 vehicles and a tractor trailer and 11 people who needed to live all happened at once, and I had made 14 decisions that didn't exist anywhere in the manual, and 11 of those people had gone home. That wasn't in any photograph my mother had ever taken. But it had been in Warren Adler's inside pocket, folded soft at the corners, kept for 3 years because at least one person believed it should be preserved. And now it was mine. If you've ever been the one whose contribution became someone else's quote, whose silence was mistaken for having nothing to say, whose name appeared 6 times in a document that told the wrong story, hit that like button. So this story reaches the person who needs to hear that someone was paying attention. And if you've ever been the anchor for someone else, in any room, in any storm, leave it in the comments. I want to read every single one.